Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala barakatuh. Alhamdulillah rabbil alamin, wassalatu wassalamu ala asyrafil anbiya wal mursalin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Alhamdulillah, in the previous video I have given you some overview of the idea of how our integrated Islamic psychology model in terms of our basic model as you find in this book, and then the expression of how the Islamic psychology model in terms of the flow of the self. And I'm just taking this in the four areas in which we discussed, that is what happened to us when we feel something. There's the action, the episode, the events that constantly is impinging upon us, both from the realm of the physical, the realm of the mental, the realm of the emotional, and the realm of the spiritual. And these filter into ourself. And ourself, when we talk about the self, the mind, it is the spiritual realm, the emotional realm, the mental realm, and the physical realm. This is integrated. This is our integrated model, SMP model. This model is Al-Ghazali model that we have adopted. Alright? And when we talk about the psychology of ourself, we have what we call the filtering process. Our self will always filter inputs in terms of values, in terms of beliefs, in terms of languages, how we conduct ourselves, in terms of decision, etc. And all this filtering will then give us an internal representation of who we are in terms of the spiritual aspect, in terms of the visual, auditory, kinesthetic. This represents what we do, and our state of the self will be then linked together. And all these things in terms of our filtering, our internal representation, and the state of the self will then act on our behavior based on the influences at all levels. So this is the integrated model of understanding our flow in terms of Islamic psychology. Okay, I'm just giving you a gross overview because naturally there's many more details needs to be filled up because of the way we are approaching ourselves. But the key is always you're talking about the self is SEMP. But when you look at modern psychology, you have the emotional element, you have the mind and the mental element, you have the physical element. So behavioral psychology, you have only the mental and the physical element, but no emotional element. That's why the nature of consciousness is absent during the time of B.F. Skinner, because they don't expect that, because that cannot be quantified. So anything that cannot be quantified in terms of behavioral psychology is thrown out. Alright, then you have humanistic psychology. When humanistic psychology come in, you have the nature of the self. With the nature of the self, you must bring the emotional self. Alright, so they put a lot of emphasis on values of emotional self. That means love, peace, care, share, and things like that. That's good. Alright, but still they are atheistic insofar as, or agnostic. They accept, for example, say, meditation. They accept, for example, thinking about the higher values, but they will not accept religion, for example. So there are this fusion, for example, like certain therapy like DBT. They take the aspect that there's a higher so-called consciousness. What is it? They don't define, and they don't call it as a religion. So it's religion-free, agnostic. All right. So they are taking half measure, which I think is incongruent with the true understanding of the nature of the self and the true understanding of the state of the self. So that's why when you talk about the state of the self, it must incorporate the spiritual element. So that's why in Islam we have the spiritual element, because from our perspective, if we go from here backward, all right, that means if we want to define our state of the self, we must define it from this perspective, our spiritual realm, emotional, mental, and physical realm, and then our internal representation of our visual, auditory, kinesthetic senses and all is also in relation to the spiritual reality. Intuition, for example, mystical experience, spirituality, feeling the closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that is beyond VAK. But if your internal representation is only VAK, you may have visual, auditory, kinesthetic, you must have some senses of the emotionality. But you can't define that, because you ask a person, where is love? Where is love? There's no definition. Where is consciousness? There's no definition. Where is this feeling of closeness? between you and your child, or between you and your baby, or between you and your spouse. That closeness. What is the feelings of the same closeness that you have between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? You cannot define that, because these are the level of consciousness that within Islam we have this hierarchy of consciousness, from just purely emotional within the physical realm, because it's interacting. That means the interaction here, or with the mental realm, or with the spiritual realm. So we have the fullness of how we can define the state of a human being. In terms of, for example, we want to define the state of happiness. Happiness vis-a-vis our spiritual happiness, of closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, of closeness to ourself, our family, closeness to Rasulullah, and so on. So we have this hierarchy of needs in terms of explaining our state of the self at the 4 levels. So within Islam and within our Islamic psychology, we bring this into one whole. So we have this one whole definition that our state is always back to the same situation, and how these are being then psychologically influenced. In terms of influences, they also would be from the behavior. We are influenced by our spiritual, emotional and mental state. The influences are also from the realm of the spiritual, emotional, mental and physical. For example, influences can be negative and positive. So there's a lot of negative influences today. For example, and if you say it's from the realm of Satan or satanic, the realm of spiritual realm, but it is satanic, not from the realm of angelic, not from the realm of the inspiration or the intuition from the realm of which Allah endow upon. You can find this definition in our book. We have the whole detail of the whole understanding of that aspect. You can go back to our chapter and you can find how this is being explained in terms of influences at the lowest level, that is the physical level, and influences at the spiritual level, which can consist not only of positive influences, angelic and inspiration from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or it can be satanic. Alright? So once we understand that, then we have the state of the self that is always influenced by all the positive values, beliefs, decision, language, etc., that you try to mold yourself, having all the influences that you're going to face as you live in this dunya. You cannot run away from that. That affects your behavior, and this whole circuit will all be the interplay of yourself as you exist on this earth. So long as you're alive, there is always the interplay of action, episode and events that you have to face every moment of your life. There would be the filtering of whatever information that you receive in terms of the filtering at the physical level, emotional, mental and spiritual level. Then you create the representation of what you are going to enhance, or what you're going to accept or anchor on. Alright? Whether it's visual, auditory, kinesthetic, intuition, senses, smell, taste, touch and so on. That means the 6 senses, not the 5 senses. We have the 6 senses. Then that affects our state of the self in terms of mutmainnah, in terms of peace or tranquility or happiness, or in terms of suffering, pain, fear, worry, meaninglessness, and the psychological problems that we face today. For example, suicidal ideation. Very prevalent. Young people, for no reason or rhyme reason, they just kill themselves. All right? It's the state of the self. Because why? Their behavior. They have the EMP, and some of them with this E, the emotional self, also is being destroyed by the video games, violent games, meaningless, no values, no anchor in terms of who I am, what am I supposed to do in this world, where am I going to after I die. They don't have the answer, so they are playing around the peripheral of the human self. The peripheral of the human self at the mental and physical level will never give you the true understanding of your purpose and meaning in life. You must be closer to the truth, and closer to the truth must include the realm of the emotion, which now we receive, we know, and then the realm of the spiritual. So we Muslims must be dedicated to bring this new psychology. It's not all the old psychology with the natural psychology, the primordial psychology, the imprint that we have given by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the moment we are created. At the realm of the azali, at the realm of the spiritual, before we ever exist on this earth. The realm of the primordial that Allah tells us, am I not your Lord? And we, spiritual beings, without the physical entity yet, we have the spiritual, emotional, and mental self to be acknowledged, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we are endowed with a spiritual DNA. So our DNA is this. Our primordial DNA, our DNA is spiritual. Okay, and then we end up with the physical DNA. This one we can understand. Alright, we go and study DNA, RNA, we study epigenetics, we study everything. Now we know this mystery of the nature of human physicality. But all this thing is a holistic whole, and we believe that is a truth. That will be the way forward in terms of saving humanity, to bring them to a higher level of consciousness, higher level of awareness, coming back to the truth of the primordial nature of our existence, and then striving to make ourselves the best of beings, because that is our nature. We are created the best of beings, the highest in the hierarchy of beings. Okay, as I say, beings also, they have hierarchy, consciousness, they have hierarchy. This has been studied by our Muslim scholars many times over. So you can go back to the old text and you can find all this very described very succinctly in the metaphysics of Islam. All right, I don't have that much knowledge in the area, but it is mind-blowing. Even you go to Al-Balkh and you go to Ibn Sina, you go to Al-Ghazali, you go to Ibn Maskiyah, they have all this understanding of the state of the self, which is very important, especially Al-Ghazali. So if we talk about this state of the self, you say, oh, this is from modern psychology. Brother, it is there in Islam. Only thing, we lost touch with the intrinsic truth that is Islam at its highest level of understanding our spirituality, our emotional realm, our mental and physical realm, and all integrated together give us a way forward in terms of leading a good life on this earth. The whole purpose that Allah created us is not to make us suffer or make us fail, but we are created to be creatures of Jannah. We are created to go to heaven, but we can choose not to go, and we can choose to reject Allah. We can choose to reject our spiritual self and try to live on our emotional, mental, and physical self, but that would be not the intrinsic nature that we are created, because our DNA is spiritual. Alright, our nature, primordial nature, is spiritual. So if you can reflect upon this message, then you understand the flow of the state of the self must always be an incorporation of the spiritual realm, emotional and mental realm, and our psychology must always go back to this truth that we will then propound, especially to all Muslims. I'm talking to you as Muslims, one of 1.7 billion Muslims, to practice the best that we can, so that those who are hungry of this truth can come to Islam and understand this beauty of this deen, and the beauty of Islamic metaphysics, the beauty of Islamic psychology, and inshallah from then develop this love for Allah and the Prophet, and strive to make ourselves good as a Caliph of Allah, making ourselves good, helping others to be good, and making the world good, inshallah.